From FingerLakes1.com and presented by FL1 Radio. I'm Josh Durso, and this is Inside the FLX. Our program today begins in the city of Geneva. In recent months, a number of headlines related to government function and transparency have raised questions in the community. The search for the next city manager, the exit of police chief Trickler, and even renovations to City Hall have all raised eyebrows and made the front page. We're going to be talking about all of those issues this hour, and for that conversation, we have Jim Meaney, founder and publisher of the Geneva Believer, and Natalie Knott, who serves as assistant public defender in Monroe County. Both have been heavily involved in all of these issues, vocal activists in the community, some would say. Thank you both for making the time and coming in. We have a lot to talk about. So, Jim, I just want to toss it over to you and sort of start this whole thing out by asking the question that's on everyone's mind. Where does the city manager search stand right this second?
Well, right this second, there's three candidates. It's been narrowed down to three candidates. The only reason anyone knows this fact is that an anonymous source contacted me and wanted me to put the news out on the blog. So there are three candidates at this moment. Two of them are men. One of them, I actually have more I have more information about one of the candidates. I haven't put it out on the blog yet. But this candidate has, both of the male candidates have checkered past, and the third candidate is Sage Gerling, who's currently the interim city manager, and also the director of neighborhood initiatives in Geneva. When that news came out, a lot of people in the community became engaged and became concerned that Sage was, at the time, reportedly last on the list of favorites for city council. So, in the past few days, there's been an action at City Hall when City Council had their executive session to discuss the hiring of the city manager. A number of people showed up to show their support for Sage. There's a petition out online right now, over 200 signatures already in support for Sage, and council is expected to be making a decision possibly at their next executive session this month, or it's not July yet, so probably in July.
So obviously there's a lot to break down within this, and we're going to sort of go into detail with all those individual pieces that you were just talking about, but I do want to toss it over to Natalie, just to first time on the show, obviously. I just want our viewers to understand who you are in the background and how you got involved with everything that's been going on in Geneva, because you've been popping up everywhere, whether it be at a rally or whether it be at a meeting. You seem to be really interested in the city.
Okay. Hi, Josh. So prior to being prior to moving to criminal law and practicing at the Monroe County Public Defender's Office, I actually was a housing, public benefits, kind of general poverty attorney at Legal Assistance of Western New York, which is based out of Geneva. It was my first job post after law school. I did some clerking before that, but I knew I wanted to be in the legal aid realm. And when I was looking for jobs, I came to Geneva and I fell in love from day one. As part of my work on behalf of my clients, I got really involved in the community. My particular area of interest is police accountability, but Geneva is such a wonderful little community with so many people, and it's with so many people whose hearts are really in a good place. They want good things for their neighbors, because we're so connected. We're so connected in Geneva, and it's a small enough town that we can actually do some really wonderful things. It's scalable. So I fell in love with Geneva. I fell in love with a lot of the people who are fighting really hard in Geneva for their neighbors. And I continue to be invested in this community. Eventually I'm going to be moving I'm from Los Angeles, California. I'm going to be moving my family out. And I think we're going to buy them a house here in Geneva, just because I love this community so much.
So I guess what I'm really interested in then is the outsider's perspective, or the perceived outsider's perspective of the city manager search itself. Obviously, we have put three people to the places now, but at the same time, this has been a very vague process at best, right?
Yes. definitely, as an outsider, it makes zero sense. I read, I believe Jackie Augustine did an accounting of kind of the comparison between the last search for the city manager and this search for the city manager. And I have to say, the previous search had it way more right. It seems like we've backslid. I can't think of any other community where that would get so locked out of such an important process. I can't think of any other city council that would lock the community out of that process, rather. And it's kind of mind-boggling to be kind of backsliding back into a way that, things were probably done, a long, long time ago. But given how engaged the community is in Geneva, it seems really an odd choice to pursue this process this way.
So, Jim, how did that backslide happen? How did that sort of, over that 8-year period, how did we get from a process that seemed to be a lot more pleasant, people were much happier about it, cleaner, better communication, to this one now?
I don't know. I don't know why they would make that decision, especially after the past couple of years of having so much pressure on them and people wanting more transparency. It's essentially the same process that they used to find Matt Horn, except they removed all of the community forums, and there was one other part that they changed around a little bit. But it was essentially they've made it a little bit less transparent. I don't know why they would do that. I think that if I had to speculate, which is what happens when there's a lack of transparency, it forces people to speculate. If I speculated, I would say that some of the counselors don't like having this pressure on them to create more transparency around everything, and maybe that's kind of their way of saying, you know what, if we let people in too much, then they're going to start demanding this and that, and then the whole process is going to become more complicated. And we'll put out a survey and we'll take the answers, and then we're going to do it all very in a very closed way. That would be my guess. I don't understand. I still don't understand why they changed the process.
So as a clerical point here, one of our viewers actually emailed us and asked a few days ago. They don't live in the city of Geneva. Has there been an actual public session yet that wasn't connected to just a regularly scheduled meeting where the public could actually provide input on the process?
No.
So it has been either through the committees, the search committees meetings privately, or just open session.
Right. Oh, and that reminds me, that was the other difference, is that when they chose a search committee back in 2008, when Matt Hornet eventually was hired, they announced within days that they were going to have a community search committee, and this time they didn't even mention the search committee until months into the process. But yeah, to answer the question, there has been the only community involvement in the city manager search has been an online survey or a paper survey that people could go and fill out at City Hall, and it wasn't in Spanish either. So,
okay, so obviously you made it clear that you did not publish the names. You intentionally did that. You did not want to zero in on anybody, and I can completely understand that. But at the same time, I'm sure there are some people out there saying, well, you just said two of them have, I believe you used the phrase sorted past to describe them. Why not release the names? Why not open that part of it up?
Well, at first I just wanted to let people know that Sage was in the running, and to let people know that the other candidates had checkered pasts. I don't think I said sorted. I think I said checkered. But now I've gotten more information on those other two candidates. And one of the reasons that City Council gave for having confidentiality around the candidates was that some of them may have jobs right now, and they don't want their current employers to know that they're job searching. I've found out that neither of the other two candidates, are employed right now. So I don't see, if that's their reasoning for keeping their identities secret, I don't. Then that reason is gone. So I think it's time to let people know who's in the search. And also, I did a quick Google search looking at other cities' city manager searches. many times they have all of their candidates out there. They, when
Right.
they come down to their final 3 or 4 candidates, those people's identities are known, and they come and they speak to the community, and everybody knows what's going on.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the sage girling aspect of this. When it was first announced that Matt Horn would be leaving, both she and Adam Blowers were considered the obvious choices, I guess, or at least from the outside. Why not Sage? Why is she not the obvious choice for city council, given the circumstances, especially given the fact that she has continued to carry on and do at least part of the job, and the public part of the job, over the last, what is now 5.5, 6 months?
That's another good question. I think council's answer would be, we want to get the most qualified candidate. We don't just want to have the most popular candidate. That would be their reasoning for it. My speculation would be, I would look at the search committee, and I would look at the makeup of council, and it's overwhelmingly male. So maybe she's not getting a fair shake because she's a woman. I also feel that Sage has a reputation of having a level of integrity within City Hall that some others in City Hall or on council may not have. They may not have that same kind of reputation. And if I were to speculate, I would think that there are some people who want someone in there who's going to serve different kinds of interests other than having that connection to the community. And maybe it concerns people that she's so well liked and so connected to the community.
Now, Natalie, when you hear that, all of what he just said, and there's a lot to unpack there, but what goes through your mind, and what do you think when you hear those types of arguments come out for or against an individual?
Well, I would say that it would not. It's not far-fetched.
Right.
I have no idea what the inner intentions of council or anybody on the search committee is, but I have to say the perception isn't great. Even if they are not intending to disregard Sage's candidacy for the position based on her gender, it doesn't look like that. It looks like a highly qualified woman who's been doing the job, and doing the job well, for the last 5 months is somehow being penalized for that in favor of 2 candidates who aren't connected to Geneva, who, yes, have somewhat questionable resumes, and who, are completely out of left field and nobody knows. Whereas I can't think of that situation happening if Sage were a man. I can't think she would. How it usually works in these types of positions is that the interim person, the person who's been connected to the position, been fulfilling the duties, is the person to beat. Any candidate would have to exhibit a resume or ability or something that would significantly improve on the current person holding the interim position. There is absolutely no evidence that that's the case. So the perception here is really problematic. Again, we can't say what the inner intent is, but it doesn't look great. It especially doesn't look great in 2018. But there has been no effort to communicate with the community about the reasoning here, and so that even compounds the perception that something is off here.
And this is just my thought after listening to that isn't knowing the community too well a really lousy reason to sort of pull someone down the list instead of propelling them up further, right? I mean,
yeah, you would think so. But again, that was speculation on my part.
Right.
But maybe when someone has that kind of connection and that kind of respect in the community, some counselors might feel that that's concerning, because as I spoke about earlier, I think there are counselors who don't like too much pushback from the community. They like us to say, we trust you to make the decisions, we voted for you, and therefore we're done, and you can make all the decisions, and we're going to trust that you're going to make the right decision. I suspect, and it's just my suspicion, that there are people on council or within City Hall who don't like who really don't like the kind of community pushback that they've been getting the past couple of years on various issues. Maybe starting with the Foundry, I think that was the one where that really shook a lot of them up and made them think, "Oh, holy mackerel! Like this can really blow up if we don't answer people." So I think that they might be trying to, circle wagons and tighten things up. And
well, okay. So the other part of this that I wanted to sort of break down and talk to you guys a little bit about was the actual diversity of the makeup of the staff, or not the staff, the committee rather, and then the choices now. Some gender diversity, but other than that, it doesn't really seem like there's been a ton of diversity introduced into this process, period. And for a community that seems to, I would have thought by now, learned its lesson with regard to this issue, doesn't really look like they have.
No, it's actually it's really disappointing, Josh. The way it really feels like the city has, first of all, a very, 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 very narrow concept of what diversity means. They have their certain community leaders that they go to for everything, and they disregard everybody else. I mean, the fact that there is not one person under the age of 40 on that committee, when the drivers in Geneva, some of the most interesting, not only leaders, developers, are under 40. We're the future of the city, and our voice isn't included in this process. It's only 30% women when Geneva is 8% women. Is it over half?
I think it's a little over half.
Okay, I thought it was in the 40s, but
yeah.
Yes. There's nobody. There's a very who is representing from the Latino community? Is it? Is Raul? But that's one person. That's one person.
Yes,
when
30%
of our kids in the Geneva City schools are Spanish speakers. There's nobody. I don't. Is there anybody from the LGBTQ community on that panel? It's just it's just they have their go-tos that they go to. They haven't bothered creating any other connections with anybody younger or with any other leaders outside the NAACP, African American Men's Association, and Mark Gramling. Mm-hmm. That's their concept of diversity.
Is the feeling that it's malice or just laziness? Or maybe a combination to some degree of both. I
mean, again, we can't. I'm wary about imputing intent, but right. I definitely think laziness is a large part of that. I'm fully comfortable saying that. Most of the younger active presence in Geneva has at one time or another opposed city council on something, and I think they are afraid of having to interact with people who have radically different viewpoints than they are and a radically different view of how the city should work. The committee process was kept so close and so tight that they needed to be assured they were bringing people on who would keep their secrets for them, which largely happened. I mean, that should say something about the search committee itself. They went along with this completely untransparent process, which should say something about who we're allowing to represent us in underrepresented communities in Geneva. Yeah. One last thing I did want to say about Sage, just really quickly. Sure. I know I find it offensive that I think Sage has somewhat of a reputation as a cream puff in the city. I've opposed her many, many times. She's tough. She does not give in. She has the city's best interest at heart, and she will hear you. But if she does not think it's the right decision, she won't be moved on that. Sage is. I respect her. I respect her integrity, but she is not a cream puff, and she does not any way feel beholden to the activist wing of the city. She does what's right for the city of Geneva.
Now, okay, so. Now moving forward, assuming in a couple months or 3 months or 4 months, however long it takes to actually get to a decision, there is a new city manager in Geneva. What kind of stage is set for that person who has really what seems like the least ideal job in the Finger Lakes then? Because most of, or at least a large contingency of the city of Geneva is going to feel somewhat uncomfortable, to put it diplomatically, with the outcome. How do they move forward? And is there legitimacy there? Is there, if the process is not legitimate, is that person who ends up fulfilling the role, even if they do a great job, illegitimate to some degree?
I think that will be the perception of a lot of people, which is why I do think that at this point, Sage Gerling is maybe their only choice in terms of choosing someone that's not going to be so under such scrutiny. Sage would still be under scrutiny, and the process is still.
You're saying there's hope there.
I'm saying there's hope there. I'm saying that whoever the new person is, if it turns out to be one of the other candidates, they're going to be under a microscope. It's going to be very difficult for people to see them as a legitimate choice, in my opinion.
So another one of the items that we're going to be talking about this hour, policing in the city. But first, I just want to talk about for a couple minutes probably the most interesting story that I've read on the Believer blog. Renovations to City Hall, something that seems like it just shouldn't be that complicated. Mm-hmm. But this city council seems to know how to make things complicated. And here we are talking about it. So what's the story here? What's going on with the renovations, and what's next?
Well, back in 2016, City Council decided to do renovations at City Hall to upgrade, to put in a new elevator. Primarily, their reasoning was for ADA compliance, right. To make it more accessible to people. So the idea was to put in an elevator, and then at the same time, and to repair the ramp and some other things. But at the same time, they wanted to also renovate the City Council chambers, which are on the second or third floor in City Hall, to bring City Council meetings back to City Hall. When they originally moved council meetings to City Hall 20 years ago, or when they moved the council meetings to the Public Safety Building about 20 years ago, that was considered to be temporary. And in the past few years, there's been a lot of concern within the community that people don't want to come to City Council meetings because it's in the police department, and some people are not comfortable going to the police department and sitting in a courtroom for those kinds of for a City Council meeting. So the money was bonded for back in 2017. The renovations were put off for a couple of years. They waited, and then it turned out they got the bids in for the renovations, and it turned out that the winning bid was $700,000 low. So these renovations were going to cost an additional $700,000 on top of the $1 million or whatever they were to start. So,
is that argued because of how much time elapsed, or just a misfire on the actual bid?
Ostensibly a misfire on the bid. I'm not sure. That was just that's where they were at. That's where they were at a month or two ago. Mm-hmm. So council was kind of balking, saying, if we're with the DRI happening, and when it comes to the $10 million DRI money that's coming into the city has to essentially bond for or borrow. They have to borrow the money, do all the renovations, and then wait for the state to pay them back. So for the next few years, the city's going to be borrowing millions and millions of dollars, getting their debt load up to a pretty high level. When it gets to a certain level, that can cause the state to start keeping an eye on the city and possibly coming in and auditing finances. So we don't want that. So adding another $700,000 unexpectedly to that debt load, council was concerned about that, I believe, and I think that might have been why they were balking on moving forward with the renovations. So then a couple months ago, one counselor brought it up during a city council meeting and said, we got to get these renovations done. If we'll get the $700,000 somewhere, we got to get this started. And of course that was Councilor Gordon Eddington. And it was unusual to see Councilor Eddington talking that passionately about anything for that amount of time in a city council meeting. He spent, it was a 24-minute conversation. 6 minutes was him insisting that we push forward and get this done. And it turns out that the company that won the bid, Massa Construction, and people have been asking questions over the past few months, not just me, it was in the Finger Lakes Times, people asking questions about why this company seems to get a lot of the bids and seems to get a lot of the jobs and the contracts with the city. And then when the meeting happened, when they were pushing, when Eddington was pushing to have the job done, council was discussing whether they could vote on it at that time, which they're not allowed to vote on anything unless it's on the agenda. Right. So it was pushed off to a special meeting a week later, where the public was invited to sit in and watch. And after that discussion, it appears that council has decided to scale back the project. It turns out that City Hall is technically ADA compliant. It's not ideal, but it's ADA compliant. People who are disabled can get into the first floor. They can get all their services done on the first floor. But still, we should, it's a good idea to have the elevator in there and to make City Hall more accessible. But the elevator is only $500,000 or something like that. So it looks like City Council is going to next month, or in July, are going to look at scaling back the project, putting it back out to bid, and having it just the elevators and maybe just the ramp or something like that. They haven't decided yet. Mm-hmm. And the reason it was such a crazy story, and the reason that it got a lot of people's attention, was because again, it was Gordon Eddington, who does have business, personal and professional ties with Massa for years, and to see him up there championing, pushing for not only for them to get paid for the job, but to get an extra $700,000 that the taxpayers are going to have to pay for, was a interesting story to a lot of people.
And doesn't that sort of issue get to the root of what people kind of hate about politics now, is the corporate, the private interest that sort of just oozes its way in no matter what happens. Common, uncommon, whatever that argument may be, how do you feel about that moving forward? It's even happening on a really local scale, right?
Yes. This is everywhere, and this, again, I mean, ultimately it gets tied down to elections, and elections being expensive, and people requiring donors. So, that's the root of this issue, is that we have a really badly designed system for people to run for office and get elected because they need to raise a decent amount of money, even in a city the size of Geneva. I'm running a campaign right now in Rochester for Rochester City Court Judge, and you'd be surprised how much all of those lawn signs cost. Mm-hmm. But yes, it's a local issue. I think people think of this happening in bigger cities, or they think of happening at statewide. We hear constant stories coming out of Albany, but it happens here in Geneva, and that's why it's important to show up to city council meetings. It's important to keep tabs on your city councilors, because this is leaking in even at this local level. It's actually probably even more insidious at this local level because everyone is so close. The families in Geneva have had connections to each other for decades going back. So often, I think also at times people don't necessarily. I think for people, the lines can get blurred in their head because they're not even, once you've been if you are born and raised in a town like Geneva and you've lived your whole life, the personal, public, private relationships, they get really blurry. And it's really, really important for us to, as a community, to press to make sure those lines stay crystal clear, like what Jim did with his article in The Believer. No, we can't do things the small town way. That's not a transparent, responsible way to be doing things. But it happens even here.
Mm-hmm. Now, policing, obviously, big topic, hard topic, but something that the city has been taking some public steps, or at least on the surface level steps, to try and repair some of the relationships that have been damaged between the police department and different portions of the community. The police chief is retiring effective July. Get us up to speed with the story, and then let's dive into some of the nuance within this whole issue and debate.
So the chief, so in January, it was announced that there would be civil service exams taking place in March for the chief job, which at the time was not an official job opening. But in the city of Geneva, the requirements for being the police chief is you have to either have lived in the city of Geneva or within like a certain 5 or 6 county range for a certain amount of time, and you need to take this civil service exam. So the civil service exams were announced, and then they happened in March, I believe, and from what I understand, a handful of Geneva officers took the exam, and possibly someone from outside of the area. And then the process is they take the person who has the highest score, or maybe a couple highest scores if they're close, and then according to the city charter, the city manager makes the final decision and hires the chief. So at this point, and then the tests were done, and then a couple weeks ago, the chief announced that he was retiring on July 10th. So at this point, city council is looking over whoever their potential new chief is, whoever scored highest on the exams. On July 10th, they could hypothetically name an interim chief if they haven't made their final decision. But we're getting very close. We're weeks away from having a new person in one of the most important jobs in the city.
Now, since the city of Geneva has an interim city manager, does that affect their ability to ultimately make that final decision? Or since there's a sharing of responsibilities at the city manager level, or is that something that regardless has to happen?
My understanding is that regardless is going to happen, and although some of the responsibilities are being shared, Sage Gerling is the interim city manager. She has the title right now, so it will be her decision.
Okay, so Natalie, policing has been under a microscope nationally, not just in Geneva, but in Geneva specifically. Some surface level steps have been taken, or so the city would suggest. Walk us through what you feel like has actually happened as far as what's actually been accomplished to repair some of the damaged relationships between the community and police over the last year and a half, 2 years.
Well, this is a complicated question because I personally feel that every time a couple of those surface steps forward are taken, we always double back, 3 steps back. So first, regarding the retirement, because this is part of that, I believe it was earlier this year, was it February, January, that when we were having the discussion over Chief Trickler's residency requirements and his failure to move into the city. Yeah. One thing that was held over the community's heads as a reason to not enforce that job requirement was, well, Chief Trickler will retire, and then where will we be? However, the fact that the state, because it's the state that offers that civil service exam for police, fact that the exam was offered in March says that the chief must have notified somebody at the state level or community level that his retirement was imminent, because the state only offers that test when they think that there's going to be a need for more chiefs. It's not one of the tests that they offer every 6 months. Right. It is a very special scheduled test that is only offered when state powers that be sees that there's going to be a need for a police chief somewhere. So, when we talk about some of these surface level steps, that's part of it. It's the fact that we doesn't feel that we can trust anything that comes out of the city or the police department's mouth about what they're doing and how they're doing it. Because every time we are told one thing, the exact opposite happens eventually, or something to that degree. So recently, Noble Ray came to the community. He came to Geneva. He did a training with the police and community members, and he also held a community forum. I attended the community forum. I thought Noble Ray was great, and I'll admit I was skeptical. I thought he was not afraid to say some really upfront truths about what accountability looks like. And he said it in a room with community members, and he said, and Chief Trickler was also sitting there. I'm told he was similarly no nonsense in the training, which is great. But then, even though Mr. Ray specifically said, no, the only way you have true accountability is if you have some sort of civilian control, and that civilian control has teeth, can actually mete out discipline and review discipline and oversee it and decide what it is. That's the only way you have accountability, and the only way you build trust in a community between police and citizens is to have true accountability. He said that. He said that multiple times. The idea of a civilian complaint ombudsman was raised, and he's like, yeah, I mean, that's fine, but that's not really, that doesn't get at the heart of accountability, because that person, where will their loyalties lie? Who appoints them? They don't, that's not really a great method. And then coming out of that, what did we have? We had a vote in the community compact in favor of not even appointing, looking into the idea of an ombudsman. As a community member, even though most people wouldn't regard me, I do. I'm starting to feel like Charlie Brown with the football. Every time they put something out there, we get a little excited. We get, a little bit happy, okay, we've done, and then it's used for cover for something else, or the exact opposite lesson is learned. It's getting to be classically seen with the football, and the appointing of the new chief is exactly that. What have we been asking for as a first step towards accountability? Transparency. Make the complaint process more transparent. Let people know what happens with their complaints. Transparency, transparency, transparency. That's all we've been asking for as a first step. And then what's the first thing that happens is we have a allegedly, surprise retirement when we know it wasn't a surprise. We know it had to have been discussed seriously, if not planned out at the beginning of this year. It hasn't been released who from the GPD, who are public employees, took the exam. It hasn't. I don't believe their scores have been officially released, so we know who's in the front running. And then the state structure itself for how you do have to choose a police chief is completely opaque. Mm-hmm. The only real hope Geneva has of any transparency here is through SAGE. Mm-hmm. And that's ridiculous from a department who's been hearing the words transparency for multiple years now.
Now, at some point, this is just my question and at the same time a little bit of perspective just on this process. We hear a lot about trainings and a lot about these education sessions and things of the like, but at what point does the rubber just have to meet the road? Like, when does progress have to actually start happening? Because you can have a lot of these sessions, but if they don't stick, if we keep having these incidents that come up that make people question the integrity of law enforcement or the community compassion, if you want to call it that, from law enforcement, at what point does there just has to start being actual results?
I think we're getting there. I think one thing that, and here's the thing, we hear that there are changes and improvements and results, but we only hear that from the police department because they don't keep official data of how they run their department. We don't have data on how many people in Geneva. We have some data. They do a report every year, but it's missing a lot of pieces, and it's missing that community input, and it's missing that community feeling of how the community feels when they see a police car from their department. And it's the people's department. Drive down their street. And that's really... it's getting to a really troubling place because just because an unarmed black teenager wasn't killed in Geneva, we're seeing that it's happening all around us. It could happen in any community in any second, and the community isn't in no way assured that couldn't happen, because the community has no ability to provide accountability for the department. There's no transparency. There's no able to provide insight. If you feel you've been wronged by the Geneva PD and you put in a grievance, it just disappears into the ether at the moment. And the people are not standing for it anymore. We're not. We're in the streets all the time. We are watching the Geneva Police Department, and we hope. Nobody wants anything horrific and tragic to happen, but we have no assurances that the Geneva Police Department is doing anything to stop that.
Right.
And that's becoming completely unacceptable to the community.
Wouldn't the data and those results that you're talking about also protect the police department in theory, if they were, to sort of begin repairing that and sort of contribute to what they allegedly want to accomplish?
It would. I do think a comprehensive study, which I will say that Tools for Social Change and the Geneva Women's Assembly are going to be collaborating on over the next year, over the remainder of 2018 to prepare. It could exonerate them. Though I want to say, as a public defender, when you keep your own books, you can do whatever you want to do with the numbers. And so that's another problem, is that if we're just taking the data that Geneva PD compiles themselves and turns over, that's fine. But really, what's actually needed is an independent audit, where somebody is looking at the practices of this police station, over a given period, and is extrapolating data based on that. Because, I will tell you, not every arrest is legitimate. Not every... Basically, it's just, you can't keep your own books. No other department in the city, every other department in the city gets audited at some point. Mm-hmm. Why don't police departments get audited?
Good question. Now, another question within the whole discussion around policing in Geneva. Domestic violence and the department, connect the dots there for those who haven't been following the sort of storyline and the concept behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for starters, last year there was the story that I reported on in the Geneva Believer related to the city councilor Angelina Marino, who had 3 911 calls to her residence with her wife, related to her wife at the time, 3 domestic violence incidents where she was the aggressor, and all 3 times nothing happened. There was no arrest. There was nothing except there was nothing that happened. So that story came out, and within that story, there was a recording that her ex-wife made where she made claims that she had personal relationships with police officers. So when the story came out, a lot of people were paying attention. Why is this counselor getting away 3 different times? At least one time when there's property being destroyed and these kinds of accusations that are going on. At least one time you would think something would have happened with her. So when the story came out, the only response from city council and from the police department was that the police department did an investigation into the claims of a personal relationship, and they found that there was nothing happening there. But they did not. Nobody made any kind of. There was no investigation, no feedback, and no response to the question of why did this happen 3 times and nothing happened. One counselor, Jason Hagerman, asked for an investigation, but he asked for it once at one city council meeting. He didn't push it. So with that hanging out there, this year there was another situation where I received information about a Geneva police officer who had a domestic violence call to his house. The police came. It was supposed to be investigated. I submitted FOIL requests. The city was supposed to take the police reports, send it to the county, and send it to the state police. So I when I submitted the FOIL to the county said we never received it. When I submitted it to the state police said we never received it. And when I submitted it to the city said we sent it to the state police. So there's questions, and then there's all kinds of stories and you know, people that you hear from in the community who talk about domestic violence and the police's response to it. So these questions are out there, they're hanging out there, and this is you know, there are statistics, I'm sure Natalie can speak to them a lot better than I can, related to police officers and domestic violence within their own families, and it's something that's there, and it's one more problem with the police department that may not be getting the same kind of focus and attention as of some of the other issues related to the community compact.
As a public defender, how concerning is that when you start to hear things like that, reports like that pop up?
That's really concerning. I mean, I have to say up front, I'm not typically in the business of creating more defendants. Mm-hmm. But as someone who regularly has clients who come in on very similar fact patterns, and they're charged typically, if it's a relatively minor thing, they're typically charged with harassment in the second degree. It could be if there's other things, mm-hmm. but harassment in the second degree, it's a useful crime. It's a violation level offense, meaning that there's no criminal conviction if you're convicted of it. And the worst that could possibly happen to you with a conviction for harassment in the second degree is 15 days in jail. In Monroe County, that's unlikely, especially on your first charge. Ontario County, not so much. It's pretty likely here that you may do some jail time. But what's useful about it is that it's a way to for police to step in and break up the parties. They can take one person, who is now unfortunately involved in the criminal justice system, which is a problem and not okay. But sometimes it's useful to break up the parties. To break up the parties in a kind of longer way. It's not just taking one person outside and talking to them. That person will be away dealing with their now really unfortunate problem for a few hours, and that gives time for things to cool down. It also gives an opportunity for the person who was allegedly abused the opportunity to apply for a temporary restraining order through the person's arraignment. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's useful. The penalties are not too bad in case it was a misunderstanding, in case something, right, happened or whatever that wasn't, or was told that was happened that wasn't accurate. But it also protects the alleged victim. The fact that didn't happen in these three cases, to me, that would have happened to my clients on the first call, the fact that happens to my clients on the first call all the time, the fact that happens to my clients on the first call when they have an alibi, they weren't even at the place at that time, mm-hmm. and that happens to them all the time, is troubling. It says to me, it's yet another clue that points to a two-tier justice system in Geneva, which is another conversation, but very much exists. Second, the other issue is the thin blue line. We know, I don't have the exact percentage number on the top of my head, but policing, as we've designed it now, is a stressful job. It's a stressful job with a high propensity for violence, the way we have designed it. It doesn't have to be that way. So you have people within a high-stress job that has a propensity for violence, and then who, may not be getting the needed mental health care that they need in order to process that because of, the way we think about certain jobs and dealing with your own problems. That's another whole culture. So then they come home. That energy has to go somewhere. It doesn't just dissipate. That doesn't mean all cops deal with it that way, but the ones who aren't dealing with the issues created by the job plus whatever issues they're bringing into it, that energy has to go somewhere. Cops it's a fact. They have a higher rate of domestic violence. But we still have the thin blue line. The same thin blue line that protects, that makes good cops protect the behaviors of so-called bad cops, so-called good cops, so-called bad cops, is the same thing that prevents them from holding cops accountable in their private life. And you see this all the time. There was a sergeant in Chicago who tortured people for 20 years. and he wasn't convicted until just a couple years ago. That required a lot of cops to not say anything if they weren't outright participating. This is a phenomenon that happens, and it's a phenomenon that, police accountability work is just trying to deal with, because it's not just hurting people who are victims of police brutality, it's hurting families who aren't getting the intervention they need and who are being placed again in these continually dangerous situations at a time where a woman is 70% more likely to die of homicide when she's in a romantic relationship with a man. This is not a time to be thin blue lining or good old boys networking this. It has to be taken seriously.
And it sounds like, and obviously it's a separate discussion and a separate conversation, but it sounds like you're saying the whole system needs to be overhauled. Not a committee needs to be formed and we need to look at these little nuanced policies. The whole thing just needs to be re-envisioned. Completely, both for the good of the community and for the good of the officers themselves. This isn't... policing is not as we've described it now. It's a job that takes a big toll on the people who do it, and their families and all of that. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's also a job that takes a toll on a community that feels in many ways under siege. They feel powerless. When I see lights behind me or I see lights on the side of the road, I get scared. My heart races, my blood pressure elevates, I get a little clammy, and I shouldn't have to feel like that, and nobody in their community should have to feel like that with the people who are supposed to be keeping the community safe. There is a way to do that looks nothing like we do it now, and it would be better for everyone involved. So my last question for you guys, obviously a lot of heavy topics that we've talked about today, but one reason or one thing that makes you feel optimistic or happy about the future for the city of Geneva?
What makes me feel happy and optimistic is the engagement of people, the increasing engagement of a lot of people in Geneva, the groups that are doing work that were mentioned earlier, Geneva Women's Assembly, Tools for Social Change, Blueprint Geneva that Jackie Augustine's involved with. People are taking more notice, people are getting more involved. And I think I've mentioned it on the show before, but there are more people talking about the next city council election, getting more involved, finding more people to run for city council. That's what keeps me loving being in Geneva, is knowing that people are want to see that change. People are starting to step out of their comfort zones and get more involved, and also to just speaking to all of these issues that I cover on the blog, including policing. It all comes down to city council. People just underestimate how much influence and power city council has. City council could potentially, with a supermajority, change the city charter and say, we want a completely civilian-run police department. Now, that would be dramatic, and then there would be, they would have to fight with the union. There would be lawyers involved, but that's potentially, that's the kind of change that can be made. So I love that people are getting more involved, not just politically, but getting involved right in the communities and making things happen. And that's my answer to that question.
Natalie?
Ooh, Geneva's got some visionaries. It's exciting to organize here because there are so many people who are engaged and curious and paying attention to discussions happening all over the country and wanting to bring that energy and those policies to Geneva and Ontario County as a whole. I wish the city realizes how lucky it is to have all of these people here who spend so much of their time literally just pulling in Geneva, just pulling with all of their might for a Geneva that is welcoming and open and transparent and accountable. And, if Geneva hasn't recognized that yet. But the wonderful thing about all these visionaries is that they are planning for the next city council elections. They're planning for the next county board elections. Tamara Cataldo lost by one vote. But she's going to be back at it. And that's happening. That energy is happening. These are these are long battles. These are battles that people have been fighting, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and we're trying to make it so our kids don't have to, but if they have to, that's fine. We're going to leave them in a better position just like we were. And so, I'm playing the long game, but because eventually, city council election after city council election, city manager selection after city manager election, though I hope Sage stays on for a very long time, we're going to win because, well, we're here and we're not going anywhere.
Right. Well, I really appreciate you guys both coming in. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on in the city. But you do a great job, Jim, the blog, and I would encourage everybody to go check it out. Where can they find you? Not only the web address, but also you're on Facebook too, right?
Yeah, Geneva Believer is on Facebook, facebook.com/Geneva Believer, and the blog is genevabeliever.com. I'm not on the gram or anywhere else at the moment, or Twitter, but that's where you can find me. And in another week and 1 day, it's the 2-year anniversary, 2-year birthday of Geneva Believer. So
happy early anniversary.
Thank you. 2 years.
Happy
we're
birthday,
just getting
Believer.
Started. Thank you.
Well, that's going to do it for us today. Remember, check out the Geneva Believer for more in-depth reporting out of the city. It's an awesome resource for anybody who lives there and even those on the outside who just want to know a little more about what's going on. You can catch Inside the FLX on Saturdays during the 10 o'clock hour on WDWN 89.1 FM in Auburn or 97.7 FM in Fulton. The program also airs on Sundays and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum Channel 1304 and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Hey, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed, Finger Lakes.